Welcome to the New Books Network.
This is the New Books Network. My name is Joe Tasca. I'm happy to be joined today by Jennifer Roberts, author of the new book, Out of One, Many, Ancient Greek Ways of Thought and Culture. Roberts is a professor of classics and history at the City College of New York and the City University of New York Graduate Center. She's written a number of books about classical antiquity, including The Plague of War and Athens on Trial. Out of One, Many is her latest contribution to the field. Jennifer, welcome, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. It's my pleasure.
I suppose I have to ask this question right off the hop. Why did you write this book? You've written extensively about ancient Greece for many years. Why did you feel it was necessary to write this particular volume?
Well, I originally went to graduate school in order to study classical intellectual history, specifically the intellectual history of Rome. And I was writing a dissertation on Roman intellectual history that was going absolutely nowhere. And then Richard Nixon resigned. And I thought, that's interesting. And I turned to a friend and said, I wonder if anything has been done on impeachment and accountability in the ancient world. And he said, oh, yeah, that's been done. But then I realized that he really didn't know very much about the topic. So I brought it up with Donald Kagan, who was the head of the classics department at Yale at that time. And he asked me how my dissertation was going. I said, terrible, terrible, terrible. And he said, do you have any other ideas? I said, well, I'm kind of interested in accountability and impeachment. And he got very excited. And it was not really possible to study that at Rome because Roman government was completely corrupt and they didn't know from accountability. But Athenians did. And Don was a Greek historian. And so I went into his office and we talked about this. And when I came back, I had changed from Rome to Greece and changed from intellectual history to political history. And I wrote to Ramsay MacMullen, my dissertation director, who was in England that year, basically, dear Ramsay, I have met Donald, goodbye. And I terminated that dissertation. And so I wrote a dissertation on Athenian politics. And the next thing I knew, I was writing another book about Athenian politics. And the next thing I knew, I was writing a book about the war between Athens and Sparta. But I still pined for intellectual history, which was what I had gone to graduate school in order to study. And my book about the history of thinking about Greek democracy and Athenian democracy had been published with Princeton University Press. And Princeton had tried to get me to write another book for them for a long time. And finally, Rob Tempio, who was the wonderful editor there, said, look, couldn't you write a Greek history, similar to Mary Beard's wonderful SPQR? I said, well, not really, because we don't have that amount of political data for Greece, but I could write a Greek intellectual history. And so the next thing I knew, I was. And I owe Rob a great deal. This book was his brainchild, and it was a pleasure to work with him. And so now the book exists. And I've gotten back to intellectual history, which was really my first love.
Tell us about the title of this book, Out of One, Many. How did you come up with that title?
Oh, I never get to use my titles. My book on Athens, which was originally called Acknowledged Folly because Alcibiades had said everybody in Athens knows democracy is ridiculous, but they do it anyway. It was called Acknowledged Folly, but the Princeton University Press said, well, nobody will know what that means. So pretty soon it was Athens on Trial. And then my book on the Peloponnesian War was going to be War Without Victory. And I really liked that because it described what happened, that even though the Spartans in theory won, in fact, they'd screwed everything up. And within, 30, 40 years, they were finished as a power on the international scene. So I really liked War Without Victory, but apparently Oxford University Press didn't. So the next thing I knew, I found that I had written The Plague of War. Now, this book started out, I think, as infinite variety. We were always going to stress the multiplicity of strands in Greek intellectual history, but it started out as infinite variety, which was what Shakespeare had said about Cleopatra, her infinite variety. And then after a while, Princeton didn't like that. So then it got turned into the Greek mind. So pretty soon, all those many drafts in my computer, which had said infinite variety, now said Greek mind, and then they said just GM. And then Princeton didn't really like Greek mind. So Rob Ciambino and I was sort of, brainstorming, and Rob came up with this quotation from Empedocles, out of one many, about the creation of the universe. Everybody thinks it's the opposite. Everyone associates it with a pluribus unum, out of many one. But it does refer to the way in which Empedocles believed that the universe was created by things coming together and flying apart, and coming together and flying apart. So this was Rob's idea, and it's grown on me. I was worried at first because I felt people would go to the bookstore and see it, and nobody would ever turn to the fellow next to him and say, "Wow, I've always wanted something about out of one many." That doesn't happen. Oh yeah, a book on out of one many. Looking for that all my life. So no, but it's grown on me. It's grown on me.
Jennifer, there's so much to talk about. Let's see how much ground we can cover here in a reasonable amount of time. You open your book by addressing the importance of mythology in ancient Greek society. What purpose did mythology serve in the Greek world, and what were the general themes of these myths?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in many ways it's my favorite chapter when people say to me, I haven't gotten around to reading your book yet. Thank you so much for giving it to me. I'm so busy. I say, just read the mythology chapter, because myth really is at the core of it. Every Greek lived in two worlds. There was the world of the everyday, which for men was fighting and farming, and for women was raising children and supervising a home. And of course, they did some farming too, although the men didn't admit it. And so they lived in that world, but they also lived in a world in their own minds of all these multifarious myths with which they had been raised. You see myth in all of Greek art. You see it on vase painting. You see it in the sculptures on temples like the Parthenon. It was just everywhere. And you raise an important point. What are myths for? Anyhow, why do we have myths? Well, in the 19th century, the Scottish scholar William Robertson Smith said that myths were designed to explain rituals. Well, some people believe that, some people don't. The anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski conceived of myth as a sort of charter of wisdom, of faith, of values that were designed to support the basic structure and the ethos of a society. Now, the French structuralist Claude Lévi-Strauss saw myth as encapsulating basic oppositions, organizing our perceptions of the world by setting up oppositions like chaos and order, sky and underworld, male and female, old and young. Well, you have Sigmund Freud, who viewed myths very much like dreams, as a reflection of a particular society's anxieties and desires. And of course, Freud's construction allots a substantial role in the formation of myth to the unconscious. We don't know where myths come from, but there were certainly a lot of persistent themes in Greek myths. I mean, some of them are plainly what we call etiological myths, from the Greek word etion, cause, and these articulate the rationale behind something. Maybe it's behind the organization of society, maybe it's accounting for natural phenomena. For example, once upon a time, Hera was a powerful goddess in her own right, and when she gets subordinated to Zeus, then that normalizes patriarchy. Some myths explain natural phenomena. The snatching of young Persephone, the daughter of the agricultural goddess Demeter, by Hades, the god of the underworld. That accounted for the existence of seasons, because when Persephone was with her husband in the underworld, Demeter was so disconsolate that nothing could grow. But when she began to divide her time between her husband and her mother, the land was barren when she was in the underworld, but it was fruitful when she was on earth, and that's where we have seasons. Well, why are crows black? Well, at one time, all crows were white. But when the crow that Apollo had sent to keep an eye on his beloved Coronis informed the jealous god that Coronis was having sex with the mortal Ischus, Apollo was so angry that he turned the animal black. Then you have the myth of Pandora, which explains where women had come from. This apparently interested men much more than the idea of where they came from. They were very interested. Where did these strange creatures, women, come from? And of course, Pandora is created as a punishment after Prometheus acts up and provokes Zeus just once too many. And of course, this is an interesting contrast to the story of why Eve was created. She was created to help Adam, but Pandora was created to punish men and make them miserable. So there are a lot of myths about the need to control women, and rape is extremely prominent in myth. Persephone was not only a season story, it was also a rape story, and it was also a marriage to an older guy story. This is what happened to Greek girls all the time. They were packed off by their fathers. And remember, Zeus actually had said that it would be okay for Hades to snatch Persephone, whose daughter. He shouldn't have done that, but Greek men handed their daughters over to their brothers to marry all the time. So she's taken off to a dark, unfamiliar place to have sex with a much older guy. This is what happened to Greek girls when they got married. So to say there was a culture of rape among the Olympians is kind of an understatement. Rape was so integral to the fabric of Greek myth that the classicist Helen Morales was moved to observe that there are more paintings displayed in art museums in Europe and North America that feature a mythological rape scene than there are paintings displayed by female artists of color. Rape was where it was as far as Greek myth was concerned.
You spend a lot of time in your book discussing the role of women in ancient Greek society and how that role evolved over time. We'll return to that theme later in our conversation. But let's talk about Greek literature. You point out that war is this primary focus of ancient Greek narrative. Why is that the case?
Boy, that's a great question. Greeks fought one hell of a lot. They were not one country, as you know. They were a bunch of independent city-states of radically different size. Athens was the biggest, and it was probably 20 times as big as the average Greek city-state. The Greeks weren't interested in uniting into one country. They had a strong sense of every city-state, every polis as its own little community, and they were also intensely competitive, with the result that they were fighting together all the time. The earliest work of Greek literature, it seems, that we have is the Iliad. There are occasional people who'll tell you the Odyssey came first. I don't believe that for a minute. I think it was the Iliad. And Iliad was not the first Greek epic about war. It's the first one that we have, but it seems to have come at the end of a centuries-long oral tradition. I'm not convinced that the Iliad was written orally. I think it was probably composed with the aid of writing, but it came at the end of a long series of oral epics, which tended to be, as epics often are, tended to be about war. There aren't an awful lot of epics that are heroic stories of women who establish a really great daycare center. No, epics are about men going off to kill each other. And the Iliad became really the Greek Bible, to some extent the Odyssey too, but the Odyssey is also about war and killing. It's about Odysseus getting home from the Trojan War and having to fight with large numbers of hostile folks, some human, some not so human, on his way home. But the Iliad was the foundational work of Greek literature, and it helped to enshrine the idea that it was war that defined a man. And there weren't a lot of other careers for elite Greeks. They didn't say, well, maybe I'll be a doctor, maybe I'll be a lawyer. I don't know. They were all into war and politics. And in Sparta, of course, you had very much a cult of war. And people think of Sparta as being a tremendously warlike culture, whereas the Athenians were always busy putting up those nice temples and writing those nice plays. But in fact, Athens fought war more than Sparta, because the Spartans had enslaved a huge number of residents of their territory of Laconia at the time of the Persian invasions. There seemed to have been 7 of these slaves called helots for every free Spartan. So they were very afraid to leave home. You would be if you had a restive population 7 times yours. It was the Athenians who were so incredibly warlike. 2 or 3 years out of every 3 or 4 during the classical period, and their Bible was Homer, and they admired the Spartans for their dedication to war. After epic stopped being the main vehicle for poetry, you had other kinds of shorter verse, and one of those poets was Tertius, who defined martial courage as the only valid measure of a man. He writes, I wouldn't take account of anyone just because he's athletic or rich or powerful or handsome, or even if he had all of those qualities, but he lacked a fighting spirit. But he says, in warfare lies excellence, the very finest thing in all the world, surely the fairest prize a youth can seek to win. A noble thing his city and its people share with him, when someone stands among the foremost spears, planting his feet with no thought of fell flight, his soul and his heart superbly trained, encouraging the man who stands next to him. And then he says, and the man who fighting in the foremost ranks loses his dear life, showers on his city. He showers on his city and all his countrymen, and on his father the greatest glory, bearing many wounds. This was the ethos of war. This was what Hector wanted in the Iliad. Not only Achilles and the other Greeks, but Hector, the Trojan, wanting to do his father proud by fighting in war. So this became something of an obsession with Greeks, and it's a great shame that they didn't take as seriously as they might have, building a fantastic temple or writing a fantastic play. And they did admire people who wrote fantastic plays. And of course, we know their names today. It's a wonderful commentary, and a sad commentary on Greek civilization, that if you ask people today, who Sophocles was and who Aeschylus was, a lot of people are going to know, not everybody. Nobody is going to know about Phidias or Ectinus or any of the people who built the Parthenon, because that skill was not as much admired as verbal skill.
We'll talk more about that later as well. You touch upon the importance of Greek poetry in your book. What were some of the main themes of ancient Greek poetry? And can you talk about the differences between epic poetry and lyric poetry?
Yeah, epic poetry came first, and it was a very important form of entertainment before electricity. After dinner, what did you do? Well, you would have a rhapsode who recited epic poetry, and he would hold a staff in his hand, and he would hold it out, and he'd get into almost a trance, and he would start writing Homer, reciting Homer. He'd start and he would go on and on and on, and there would be a lot of repeated passages which would help him to remember what he was doing. And some people with some people were characters like Nestor, who was pretty old, and he would go on, probably not as old as I am, but pretty old. And he would go on and on. I don't do that, of course. Nestor would go on and on. And I always thought that when Nestor was at bat, people would say, hey, let's bathroom break, bathroom break. It's Nestor. He'll be going on for a while. And so this was a wonderful form of after dinner entertainment, which went on for quite some time. You wouldn't recite the whole Iliad or Odyssey after in the evening, but you might recite a whole book. It was each divided into 24 units called books. And this was unchanging and largely impersonal. Now the poet did sometimes intrude himself into the poem. Once in a while in the Iliad, you have Homer addressing one of his characters. He addresses Patroclus, Achilles' friend, whose death breaks Achilles' heart and makes him come back into battle. But mostly the poet does not speak in his own voice. He speaks in the voices of his characters and really his own voice, but he does not address his characters. He does not speak in the first person. He speaks in the third person or to the second person when he's addressing the muse. Then you have lyric poetry in which people speak in the first person. When Sappho says, some say the most beautiful is, a troop of soldiers, and some say it's a naval armament, but I say it is the one whom you love best. This I say is what you get in lyrics, and you get people in lyric poetry disagreeing with what other people might say, which is similar to what you get in the pre-Socratic philosophers. So and so thinks this, but I thinks this, and Archilochus not only talks about what he personally thinks, but he criticizes the whole heroic ethos. The worst thing you could possibly do in Homeric poetry, and the worst thing you could possibly do in classical Greece, was to throw away your shield. You've heard about the Spartan mother who, when she sends her son off to war with his shield, says, come back with this or on this, because dead Spartans were carried home on their concave shields. And what she means is, we don't want you to throw this away because that's what a coward does. And Archilochus threw his away, and he wrote about it. He boasts. He says, no doubt some Thracian guy has got my shield. More power to him. It's in perfect shape. I was forced to leave the thing behind under a bush. Me, though, I got away. The hell with that old shield, since I can buy another one that's every bit as good. You couldn't get more anti-heroic than a guy saying, I threw away my shield because I'm alive, and that's what matters. You don't hear anybody in Homer saying that, and you don't hear anybody in Sparta saying that.
Jennifer, you referenced the classical Greeks. They, in particular, are renowned for their contributions to art and drama. You mentioned some of the preeminent figures in Greece whose works are so dearly valued today. Why was art and drama so important to the Greeks?
That's a really good question. Art was important all over the Greek world, and there are magnificent temples and other monumental buildings throughout the Greek world. What we don't have is very much wall painting, but we do have magnificent statues, and we have architecture, and we have the relief sculpture on works of architecture. The Greeks were very interested in beauty. Plato would come really to equate beauty and truth in a marvelous way. And what's interesting is that although you have art all over the Greek world, it's in Athens that you have drama, and not only comedy, but most particularly tragedy. And it was a distinctly Athenian art form. It was much appreciated in other parts of the Greek world. There were theaters built all over the Greek world, which, as you know, the Greek world extended all the way really to Spain, practically in the west, and to North Africa in the south, and then all the way to the Black Sea and Ukraine in the east, over to Turkey. it was all over, and they did have theaters and they did produce Greek drama. But when we say Greek drama, we really talk about Athenian drama and Athenian, tragedy in particular, which was a wonderful multivocal art form in which playwrights examined the Athenian democracy and examined all the sources of tension in Athens, the tension between male and female, the tension between parent and child, the tension between Greek and non-Greek. This was all explored in Greek tragedy, which was, as I said, multivocal, a tragedy with many different voices, and it was appreciated throughout the Greek world, but it was created in Athens.
What were some of the main themes of Greek tragedy? In what ways did the dramatists question the values of Greek society?
Right. The themes of Greek tragedy were, of course, themes of conflict. You don't have any drama without conflict. If somebody comes out onto the stage and says, "What a beautiful day, let us have a picnic," and the next person says, "That's a great idea, I'll bring coleslaw," you don't have much of a drama. But if someone comes out and said, "What a fabulous day for a picnic," and then someone else comes out and says, "The king has forbidden picnics throughout the land," then you've got something going because you've got some conflict. So in Greek tragedy, you look at Greek tragedy at first, and it's so stylized. You think, well, that has to make it really just a product of its time and place. I mean, it's composed in verse. It has these elaborate highfalutin choruses that are very difficult to follow. All the actors are men, even though some of them are supposed to be female, but they're wearing masks. But let's get real, they're men. Besides, you can't see their faces through the masks. And the plots come from Bronze Age mythology, hundreds of years before they take place. There's running commentary from a chorus, which is singing and dancing. And there's all sorts of crap about fate and gods. And, there's nothing about the minutiae of everyday life. Nobody ever is looking for their credit card or has to pee. I mean, it's this, glorious abstract world. But, in fact, the truth is very different. Greek tragedy is very much about the life that we live today. It's about suffering. It's both suffering brought on by your own actions and suffering which is eminently undeserved, and the challenge of distinguishing between the two kinds of suffering. Is it my fault? Is it not my fault? Boy, did Oedipus spend a lot of time on that. It's about the difficulty of knowing the right thing to do. It's about bewilderment in the face of the unexplained and sometimes completely inexplicable. It's about the fragility of human happiness, of human life itself. It's about identity and about the challenge of imagining and interacting with people who are not like us. It's about choice, responsibility. It's about conflict, rage, vengeance, family, love, sex. It's about ambition and uncertainty and causation. It's about unintended consequences and collateral damage. It's about the costs of war, and it's about democracy and anxiety in an era of changing values. It expands our sensitivity to suffering because it underlines the mutability of fortune and the unpredictable nature of life and the limited control we have over our futures. It reminds us always to expect the unexpected. So, what could be more relevant to our own concerns?
Absolutely. There's a reason that these works have lasted the test of time. Ancient Greece, Jennifer, was also where the discipline of history began. You talk quite a bit in your book about Herodotus, who wrote about the Persian Wars, and Thucydides, who documented the Peloponnesian War. In fact, he wrote an entire book about that. What can we learn about the human condition by studying the works of, in particular, these two men today?
Yeah, they're both magnificent historians, and in very very different ways. I always thought when I was young and in college that I was a Thucydides person, and then I grew up and discovered I was a Herodotus person. Um, and I've written extensively about both Herodotus and Thucydides. They were very different people. I often spend time trying to decide if I could have dinner only with Herodotus or only with Thucydides.
Oh,
You know,
boy.
which would I choose? I know. I would have one hell of a lot more fun with Herodotus. I'm not sure Thucydides ever smiled. Um, but but he was also an interesting character, wasn't he? Yeah, Herodotus. Herodotus begins his history of the Persian Wars by saying that he wants to memorialize the glorious deeds of both Greeks and non-Greeks, so that the passing of time should not draw color from them. He talks a lot about thaumaata, wonders, and he sees the world as full of wonders. He studied many different cultures, which was a very un-Greek thing to do. Most Greeks did not think that non-Greek cultures were of any interest. Maybe Egypt a tiny little bit, because it was so old and unchanging. The Greeks loved the idea that things could stay the same. They were very threatened by change. The Romans were too, made them very anxious. They would have hated our world. But Herodotus is fascinated by the variety of cultures that he sees in the world. He's fascinated by the variety of roles that he sees taken on by women, which wasn't true in mainland Greece. It was a little bit true in the part of Greece where he lived. He lived over in what is today Turkey, and women had a lot more freedom there. And he's very impressed by smart queens. He loves writing about very, very smart queens, and really and any smart women. And he loves writing about foreign customs and solving problems, and how there were these sheep that had very, very long tails, and they dragged on the ground and they got sore, and it was awful. So the people built them these little carts, and they could put their tails on the carts, and there were no more sore tails, and problems solved. And he loved finding ways of solving problems, and he loved the multiplicity of ways he found in his research of solving problems. And there's a spirit when you read Herodotus about the wondrous inventiveness of the human race. You get that in Sophocles, who was rumored to know Herodotus. The Herodotus's line about how you shouldn't count any man happy until he's dead also comes up in Sophocles' Oedipus. Um, and the wondrousness of human life comes across in Herodotus. In Thucydides, you really get the tragedy of human life. Thucydides sees this terrible war between Athens and Sparta, which went on with some breaks for 27 years. He sees it as a terrible, terrible thing. He doesn't see it as glorious in any way. He doesn't see glory in war. He talks about how things are likely to happen again in a similar way as long as human nature remains the same. He has this beautiful paean to Athenian democracy in Pericles' funeral oration, and then immediately afterwards, Athens is hit by the plague, and everything goes to hell, and people throw out ancestral customs, and they just take bodies and throw them on pyres that were built for other families. And it's just terrible demoralization. They don't worry about breaking the law because they figure they'll never get around to paying the penalty. And then he talks about one of the terrible civil wars that broke out during the Peloponnesian War. I think he may have been even there a little too optimistic. He said, well, there were more civil wars among the Greek states than before during the Peloponnesian War, because the Athenians could be brought in by the Democrats and the oligarchs could bring in the Spartans. But the truth is that there were dozens of civil wars in the 4th century after the Peloponnesian War was over. So, it was even worse than Thucydides thought. He didn't live long enough to see that. But he says, in connection with a brutal civil war on Corcyra, which is Corfu today off the west coast of Greece, he says, war is a biastidaskalos, a violent teacher. And in connection also with the plague, he talks about how stress breaks down people's normal moral reserves, and they do things that they would never do otherwise. So he has a very strong sense of the dark side of human nature, which is not what we see so much in Herodotus. You don't come away from Thucydides thinking, "Wow, the human race is just fascinating," the way you get in Herodotus and in Herodotus' pal Sophocles. I mean, it's Sophocles who writes in Antigone the chorus that's known as the Ode to Man, which is about all the wonderful things that human beings, mostly male human beings, but that's another story, the things that human beings have invented and how they've subjected nature to their will and how incredibly daring and imaginative they are. And you get that also in Herodotus. You don't get that sense of joy in Thucydides.
Jennifer, I want to get back to something that you alluded to earlier in our conversation, the fact that the Greeks placed this enormous importance on verbal articulacy. They believed it was absolutely critical to express yourself extremely well. Why was this such a priority?
That's a really interesting question, and it's easy for me to jump right in and say, yes, well, words were so incredibly important in the Athenian democracy, and so much of what we know about Greece comes from Athens, but it goes back beyond that. If you go back to the Homeric poems, Achilles is sent off by his father to be a speaker of words and a doer of deeds. And we think of Achilles as being a doer of deeds, but in fact he was also very much a speaker of words. And when he has fallen out with Agamemnon, the Greek commander in chief, and Agamemnon sends Odysseus to his tent to try to get him to come back to the fighting, Odysseus finds Achilles playing musical instrument and singing the Clea Andron, the glorious deeds of men. Achilles is very much a speaker, and being a good speaker and a proper speaker was very important to the Greeks. Odysseus was a famously wonderful speaker, not a very truthful speaker. The Greeks did not place the kind of value on truth that we do. They didn't have any problem with the fact that Odysseus was not Mr. Truthful. And after he delivers his speech to Achilles, Agamemnon has said to him, if he will come back to the fighting, I will give him this many islands and this many tripods and this many cauldrons and yada, yada, yada. And he could marry my daughter, which is, of course, the last thing Achilles wants. And the last thing Agamemnon says is, and tell him that he should obey me because I'm older and kinglier. And Odysseus reproduces the speech, but he leaves out the part about tell him he should obey me because I'm older and kinglier. And Odysseus says, as I hate the doorways of Hades, do I hate the man who conceals one thing in his heart and speaks another. So, being able to speak was tremendously important long before the advent of Athenian democracy. In the Iliad, King Priam, the king of Troy, tells how Odysseus came to Troy to try to get Helen back. And Odysseus was what we call a Sitzweise. He was a tall guy when he was sitting because he had short legs and his torso was big. But when he stood up, he wasn't very tall. And Priam said, he didn't look like much. And he opened his mouth to speak. The words drifted down like snowflakes. And so being a wonderful speaker was very important long before the advent of democracy. Then when democracy does develop in Athens very slowly over a couple of centuries, then being able to speak in the assembly was enormously important. And this is where the sophists come in the 420s. Gorgias from Leontini in Sicily, which of course then was dotted with Greek colonies. Gorgias comes to Athens and he makes quite a splash. And pretty soon Athens is inundated with these itinerant intellectuals, the sophists, from all over Greece. There were a couple of Athenian sophists, but they're very rare. Most of them were Greeks from other parts of the world, and they taught all kinds of skills at speaking, which you couldn't pick up through Greek education. Greek education was not anything that we would call education today. Basically, you learned poetry and you learned it orally. To be educated didn't necessarily mean you knew how to read or write. You knew how to recite poetry. But if you wanted to get up in the assembly and make a persuasive speech, or to get up in court, and the Athenians were very litigious, if you wanted to make a persuasive speech in the assembly or in court, you couldn't just get up and quote something from Homer. You needed to know the skills of argumentation, and this is what the sophists taught. But Greeks were very ambivalent about these skills. The last thing you want is to send your son to a sophist for some education so that he can get ahead in politics, and then he comes home and gives you 17 reasons why you should raise his allowance. It did not necessarily go over very well with Greeks. So there was a lot of ambivalence about the sophists. People who studied with them liked them, but people who didn't, or who didn't have the money to, were resentful. What is it that these people are teaching anyway? And they taught things like Pythagoras taught, well, as to the existence of the gods, there are many obstacles that stand in the way. There's the shortness of human life. There's the difficulty of the subject matter. People didn't like the idea that rules were made by people, not by gods. So, the sophists got into a lot of trouble, but the Athenians were fascinated by words. Cleon, who was an Athenian politician whom Thucydides could not stand, says, oh, you people, you love speeches. You just love words, words, words. And he's highly critical of the Athenians. So, being a wordsmith was tremendously important. And as I said, wordsmiths like Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides were enormously revered, as was the comic dramatist Aristophanes. Whereas people who built ships and people who did other tremendously important things for the civilization were not revered in the same way because they were not wordsmiths.
We'll talk more about religion and philosophy later on in our conversation. But I want to get to this because this was a really interesting point that you made in your book. You talk about the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century. And I'm interested to hear about how colonialism helped spread Greek culture during this time, and of course, in the Roman period.
Yeah, Greek culture, so the spread of Greek culture began very early. But by the 6th century, you had hundreds of independent Greek states dotting the shores of the Mediterranean, the Aegean, even the Black Sea, because many states dealt with overpopulation and the insufficiency of natural resources by sending out colonies. And these greatly extended the reach of the Greek world, which by the classical period in the 400s extended widely across the Aegean and the Mediterranean from Spain to Ukraine. There were Greek cities in Africa, Italy, Turkey. Everywhere the olive could grow, there were Greeks. And interestingly, unlike what we think of as colonies today, while they retained sentimental and religious ties to their founding states, colonies were politically independent from the get-go. There was never a period where a colony was dependent on its founding state, its mother state. Over several centuries, about 80 Greek states participated in the colonization movement. Miletus in Turkey was said to have sent out about 100 colonies. I think that's an exaggeration, but they sure sent out a lot. And in time, there were over 1,000 Greek city-states in the Aegean and nearby, many of them covering less than 100 square miles. By 500, the population of colonies accounted for some 2/5 of all Greeks. Population size varied radically. Some were just 100 families or so. But But, in colonies, people had to give thought to the best way to live together, especially since the locals might not be too happy about the new arrivals and might be hostile. So colonization, among other things, in addition to opening up trade, fostered, serious political thinking.
You talk about how the ancient Greeks dedicated quite a bit of their time trying to figure out what political system is best for society. We here in the United States and in much of the Western world view democracy as the gold standard. What did the Greek philosophers think about democracy?
Right. It's very interesting that Athens, which seems to have been the home of democracy, nonetheless also gave birth to the anti-democratic theorizing that was dominant until the 19th century. Political scientist J.S. McClelland pointed out that it could almost be said that political theorizing was invented to show that democracy, the rule of men by themselves, necessarily turns into the rule of the mob. This is certainly what America's founding fathers believed. James Madison said that even if every Athenian had been a Socrates, every assembly meeting would still have been a mob. And John Adams was just horrified by the idea of letting people vote who didn't own property, and had nothing good to say about Athenian democracy. And then when the French Revolution came along, the idea of non-monarchic government seemed even scarier. It wasn't until really the second third of the 19th century with the reform bills in Britain that democracy began to be popular. Wordsworth said at the end of the 18th century, "I am of that odious class that men call Democrats." It was not a popular position until about, 1830-ish. I'm just taking a stab at that date. Certainly the great philosophers of Greece, by which we mean the great philosophers of Athens, took a very dim view of democracy. Plato attacked it as amateur government. He shows us Socrates pointing out that while the Athenians gathered in the assembly to do something having to do with building, they only listened to builders. And when the matter under consideration was the construction of a ship, they summoned the shipwrights. And if some untrained person who didn't know anything about ships ventured an opinion, he'd just be laughed down, even if he were rich or handsome and came from a very famous family, which is, of course, a wonderful encapsulation of the way most Greeks thought. But Plato says when they deliberate on something connected with the government, they'll listen to any old person with absolutely no qualifications, and nobody thinks to point out to him that he doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. Aristotle did not believe that people who worked for a living should really be allowed to vote. The Greeks categorized certain kinds of labors as what they called benozik, which mean literally done over a hot stove. But this was sometimes just a metaphor for hard physical labor. And Aristotle believed that this harmed the mind as well as it harmed the body, and he did not believe that people who worked at that kind of trade should be allowed to vote. Aristotle believed that hardly anybody should be allowed to vote. He understood that you had to let some people vote so you didn't have, civil war and violence. But but for reasons other than just keeping people, pacified, he didn't really believe that too many people were qualified to vote. And of course, it's a problem that we have today. There's no question. Some people are better at making political decisions than others, but how do you decide, which these people are? We've never solved this problem, but Plato and Aristotle took a very dim view of democracy, as did many of Greece's other intellectuals, not the playwrights. Aeschylus probably the earliest, but Sophocles and Euripides had, nice things to say about democracy, but most Greek philosophers took a very dim view of democracy, which is fascinating because when we say these Greek philosophers, we mean Athenians, and Athens was a democracy. But it may be partly because Athens was a democracy that they saw the weaknesses of democracy. If they had lived in oligarchies, maybe they would have been talking all the time about how terrible oligarchy is.
We've spent a lot of time talking about the virtues of ancient Greek society, but you dedicate a significant amount of space in your book to the mixed legacy of the Greeks. Tell us about how the Greeks regarded slaves and foreigners in particular. How were they treated in ancient Greek society?
Well, there was a lot of overlap in Greek thinking between slaves and foreigners. Greeks talked a lot about not enslaving other Greeks. When the Athenian lawgiver Solon came to power, he was very distressed that some poor Athenians had been enslaved for debt, and he not only made it illegal to enslave an Athenian for debt, although it was not illegal to sell your daughter into slavery if she wasn't a virgin. This may have been an improvement over old laws. There was some story about a man who discovered his daughter wasn't a virgin, so he shut her up in a room with a horse until the horse ate her or something. Anyway, we seem to have an improvement here that you couldn't feed your daughter to a horse, but you could enslave her. But an Athenian man after Solon could not be enslaved, and Greeks talked a lot about how they didn't enslave other Greeks. This stopped being true insofar as it ever was during the Peloponnesian War, when the Spartans made slaves of the people of Plataea who had resisted them. The Athenians made slaves of the rebels on Mytilene. They enslaved all the people on Milos whom they did not kill. They enslaved the people of Scione whom they did not kill. It was not true that Greeks didn't enslave other Greeks, but it was a common belief, which has its greatest articulation in Aristotle, that people who were not Greeks were natural slaves, and there was a question as to why this was so. I think Herodotus felt that Persians were, because they were all essentially slaves to the king, that they didn't really get the freedom concept. But other Greeks talked about how it was nature that explained how other races were different. Diogenes Laertius, who was a biographer who lived quite late but wrote biographies of earlier Greeks, quoted, "I am grateful to fortune for three things. First, that I was born a human being rather than a beast. Next, a man rather than a woman. And third, a Greek rather than a barbarian." This was sometimes attributed to Thales, the pre-Socratic philosopher, sometimes to Socrates. It probably could have come from the mouth of almost any free Greek man. You also see it in the Talmud, which substitutes the dichotomy Jew-Gentile for Greek barbarian. Greeks weren't unique in their propensity to assimilate foreigners to women and animals. Greeks had almost no sense of the universality of the human race, although I think to some extent Herodotus did, but most didn't, or of universal human rights. Most took it for granted that other ethnicities were inferior. The disagreement was, were they inferior because of their political institution, that is, monarchy? Was it because of biology? Was it because of weather? There were a variety of scientific writings that explored differences among the races, and they always concluded that the Greeks were superior. Around 400, the physician Hippocrates or one of his followers composed a treatise on the effects of climate and environment on health and character, known as Airs, Waters, Places. And it argued that the dispositions of each ethnic group corresponded to the nature of the country in which it lived. For example, the dramatic change of the seasons combined with frequent rains and droughts and wind to make the inhabitants of Northern Europe wild and unsociable, but they were courageous. In the East, on the other hand, The consistent climate was conducive to cowardice, and indolence. But wouldn't you know, the Greeks, funny about that, the Greeks were not vulnerable to these disabilities. Aristotle pointed out that the Greeks, who had the good fortune to live neither in chilly northern Europe nor in unduly mild Asia, the Greeks possessed an ideal character. He said the peoples inhabiting the cold places and those of northern Europe, they're full of spirit, but they're somewhat deficient in intelligence and skill, so they're lacking in political organization. Now, the peoples of the Near East, on the other hand, they're intelligent and skillful, but they lack spirit, so they're always in subjection, in fact, slavery. But the Greek race, wouldn't you know, the Greek race just as dwells in the middle position geographically. It partakes of both characters, for it is both spirited and intelligent. Thus, it continues to be free and to enjoy excellent political institutions, and if it were united, would be capable of ruling the whole world. So, not surprisingly, when you get him on slavery, he says, well, you see, we can tell that slaves have slavish natures. How? Well, because they're slaves. Okay. Otherwise, they wouldn't have become slaves, because they would have won that war. So they must be. And it's amazingly that there was no anti-slavery movement in Greece. There were some individual sophists, who raised questions about slavery, and there were sometimes some individual playwrights who raised questions about slavery. But the idea of an organized anti-slavery movement didn't exist. The Stoics believed that naturally, deep down, slaves were just as free as free people, but they didn't take the natural step of saying, okay, I'm freeing my slaves, because they were supposed to enjoy being free, deep down, because it felt so good, deep down.
Well, speaking of a class of people who were looked at as inferior in classical antiquity, let's talk more about women in ancient Greece. You point out that women gained more freedom in Greece during the Hellenistic period. Tell us a bit about that evolution.
Yeah, people say frequently that women had more freedom in the Hellenistic age, including in Athens. And I was interested in that, and I wrote to a friend. We now use the word friend rather loosely to include people we communicate with only on Facebook, with whom we've never been in the same room. But I wrote to a Facebook friend whose book I had admired very much about women. I said, tell me, what's the evidence for women having more freedom in Athens during the Hellenistic period? And she had some difficulty in coming up with that. We know that in Hellenistic Egypt, for example, women had a lot more freedom, but they also had a lot more freedom in pre-Hellenistic Egypt. We're lucky enough to have a lot of letters from Egypt when Egypt came under Greek domination, really, we might say Macedonian domination, after the death of Alexander, when it fell into the power of his general Ptolemy the First, and then Ptolemy the Second, and Ptolemy the Third, and Ptolemy, yeah. So Cleopatra, I believe, was married to Ptolemy the 13th. There were a lot of Ptolemies, and in Ptolemaic Egypt, we have a lot of letters from women. And we do get some sense of what their lives were like. They obviously were not all shy about asserting themselves, and they claim respectful treatment. A woman named Somali complains that her son is getting beaten up, and Hykes asks for help recovering her daughter, who has run off with a married man. She says she's getting on in years, and she has a beer store, and she can't run the beer store very effectively without her daughter. A woman named Senkon needs to get her donkey back. A fellow had run off with it. And there were even a few, Hellenistic women poets. Now, where you have royalty, which you have to some extent even in Greek civilizations, as well as often in Egypt, Where you have royalty, you have royal women, you have marriage alliances, and those women certainly have, a certain amount of power. On the other hand, you had royal women in much of early modern Britain, and that does not seem to have changed the status of the average woman in Britain. The fact that Elizabeth I was on the throne, or Queen Anne, or whoever, didn't really seem to change the status of women. I'm not sure that the status of women changed, particularly under Margaret Thatcher. So, we don't know. What we do know is that in the period of Macedonian domination after the death of Alexander the Great, we do know that the average amount of political power in the hands of an Athenian man was not what it used to be. And it makes sense that they would have this narrowed the gap between the amount of power and importance they had in the state and that of their wives and sisters and daughters. So it makes sense that they would have turned more for their validation as people to their families, and that this would have improved the situation that the decline in the situation of men meant more of an egalitarian situation between men and women. But we really don't know, and we don't know as much as we would like about marriage in the lower classes. And in the upper classes, marriage was very much arranged. It was very much political, um, and and men who were sufficiently affluent didn't need their wives to do that much. They needed to manage the household and manage the weaving to produce clothing for the household, and sometimes some surplus to sell. But there were also slaves in those houses, and a tremendous amount of the work got done by enslaved workers. Whereas in the lower classes, women contributed much more because they didn't have enslaved workers in the house. And so, I suspect that marriages in the lower classes, were much happier because men did not, first of all, they weren't arranged as much as the upper class marriages because they weren't looking for good political matches. And also, husband and wives had to work together all the time to stave off poverty. So, I would guess that a disproportionate amount of what we know about Athenian marriage, which seems to have been a very oppressive institution, concerns bourgeois upper middle class marriage.
Jennifer, a major part of ancient Greek life revolved around religion.
Yes, it did.
Tell us a little bit about the role that religious rituals and festivals played for the Greeks at this time.
Yeah, there was no canonical text that dictated what a Greek should believe. It was really ritual that stood at the core of Athenian religious experience. I'm not sure that what Socrates got in trouble for was anything that he believed as much as his not participating in rituals, which he found kind of silly. The divisive doctrinal quarrels that have divided the Abrahamic religions into different sects, often resulting in horrific bloodshed. This would have been inconceivable in Athens. Myth told how Aphrodite had been created from the foam arising from the genitals of Uranus when he was castrated by his son Cronos. But then again, it also identified her as the daughter of Zeus. And it was believed that Zeus had been raised by the nymph Adamanthea, or maybe by a goat named Amalthea, or maybe the goat was a nymph, or maybe he was raised by his grandfather. And then when Zeus grew up, he was believed to have fathered the blacksmith god Hephaestus. But then again, though, people said that Zeus's wife Hera had given birth to Hephaestus by parthenogenesis, and that Hephaestus didn't have any father. And Greeks didn't come to blows over this. They didn't say, "Oh yeah, you think Zeus was raised by a goat? Why don't you step outside?" No, they didn't get into arguments about this. It was a fluid system. What was really incredibly important was these rituals, and what the Greeks believed that the gods really liked was for the whole community to come together and butcher a really large, expensive animal. And they also persuaded themselves that what the gods liked most of all was the delicious aroma of the smoke from when you barbecued the animal rising up to Olympus. That the gods weren't interested in the meat. Wasn't that convenient? Because that left all the meat for the people. So scholars have been arguing just for generations about what was this sacrifice all about? Did it reenact an original human sacrifice that had taken place centuries and centuries before? Did it focus all the tensions in the community on one particular scapegoat object so that it released the people from being in tension with one another? What was sacrifice about? Was it about getting people fed? I mean, all kinds of books have been written about this because it's so fascinating. Why this sacrifice? And of course, you had some, parallel in Christianity with communion and the body and blood of Christ. So what were the Greeks doing with these animals? And they also made sacrifices in the home. In the home, you couldn't necessarily afford to sacrifice an animal. Sometimes you would sacrifice grain. I tried to explain this to a friend a few days ago, that he'd gotten a good parking space. And I said, but could you get that without a sacrifice? He said, yeah, I sacrificed 3 flies to Zeus. It's the meaning, doesn't it, Joe, to the concept of a sacrifice fly. So he had sacrificed flies to Zeus. And I said, well, that was good. He said, what would I have done if I hadn't had any animals? I said, hey, you could have sacrificed a little grain. He was astonished to discover that you could sacrifice something that had never been alive, but, in a pinch in the home. But in festivals, you sacrifice animals. And they had this really creepy ritual where they would sprinkle a little water on the animal's head, and the animal would not like this, and it would shake the water off. And as it shaked its head, they would say, oh, it's shaking its head, it's nodding, it wants the sacrifice, it wants us to butcher him. Okay. Yeah, that's up there with belief that what the gods really like is the smoke, right? So the Greeks had a lot of really, convenient beliefs, but these rituals were what kept the community together. There was music, there was dancing, there were parades. There wasn't just meat. So these rituals were really the core of Greek religion, and people didn't get into arguments about what they ought to believe. It wasn't about belief; it really was about ritual.
How did the Greeks view their gods? Were these gods omniscient and omnipotent?
Well, when you have more than one God, you can't have omniscience and you can't have omnipotence. The Greeks really believed that the gods had been created out of the universe rather than the other way around. They didn't believe that the gods had created the universe. First there was chaos, and then there was night, and then there was yada, yada, yada. And eventually, you get gods, but by definition, since they're always at each other's throats, they can't be either omniscient or omnipotent. And, the Greeks had a very strong sense that the world was not fair. So there was no particular reason to imagine that the gods would be fair. And, you knew that some forces of nature were at war with other forces of nature. You certainly couldn't be omniscient because there was so much to know, and you couldn't be in every place at once, and you couldn't be omnipotent because you might get crossed by another god. So, the Greeks had a sense that the natural world was turbulent and scary and amoral, and they believed that the gods were turbulent and scary and amoral, and they could just turn on you. I mean, when Aphrodite is trying to persuade Helen in the Iliad to go up to Paris's bed, and Helen is grossed out by Paris and she doesn't want to go. And Aphrodite says, you do what I say, or I shall come to hate you as now I terribly love you. And, gods could change. Athena had been always very pro Hector, but at the very end, she and Zeus decide, it's Hector's time to die. So she disguises herself as Hector's brother, Deiphobus, and he's on the battlefield about to face Achilles, and he thinks, oh, I'm good because Deiphobus is here. And then he turns around, he realizes, oh no, it was not Deiphobus. It's, I'm so screwed. And so Hector realizes that the jig is up because he's been betrayed by Athena. So the gods were changeable and they were amoral. And, this was why Plato was so down on the poets. Plato thought that the image of it was impossible to separate the poets from the gods. And he believed that the gods had been portrayed in such a negative way by the poets that he didn't want poets in his ideal state of the Republic.
Jennifer, in ancient Greece, it was absolutely vital to properly bury your loved ones and to maintain family tombs. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a common belief that makes humans different from animals, that we bury our dead. And a Greek who was being considered for a job, who had been chosen, and many Greeks were chosen by lottery for jobs, had to undergo an interrogation called the dokimasia, the trying out. And it always strikes me as funny is that dokimazo in modern Greek means to try, so that if you're introducing someone to a new food, you tell them, oh, dokimaz, try it. So these trials, you had to explain that you maintained a tomb for your parents, that you maintained a family tomb. It was a very big deal. After a big naval victory in 406, the Athenians were victorious over the Spartans, but a storm came up and bodies were scattered, some dead, some alive, across quite some expanse of sea, and the Athenians were unable to pick them up, and the generals who were in charge were all executed. And a lot of those people were dead already, but the Athenians thought that the burial was tremendously important. And of course, we know about Sophocles' Antigone, where after Oedipus dies, his sons get into a civil war, and his brother-in-law, who's also his uncle, let's not go there, Creon, has taken over as king, and Creon decrees that the brother whom he considers traitorous must not be buried. And this is despite the fact that he knows that that brother has a very strong-minded sister, Antigone, and that she's going to want to bury the body, and she does, and he executes her for that. But she feels very strongly the duty to bury the body of her brother. And the Greek general Nicias, during the first 10 years of the Peloponnesian War, he had left an island where he had been victorious in battle, and he suddenly realized that he had left behind a couple of bodies, and he went back. Even though it meant yielding the victory in the battle, he went back to collect those bodies because that was tremendously important. And you'll remember in the Odyssey, where Odysseus's man Elpenor falls off the roof of the witch Circe's house, and Odysseus leaves him unburied. And when he goes down into the underworld, he is informed that Elpenor has been unburied, and he has to go back to Circe's island to bury Elpenor. So yes, the burial of bodies was of tremendous importance, as it is to a considerable extent today.
Jennifer, let's talk a little bit about ancient Greek philosophy, which is arguably the most lasting legacy of the Greeks. Tell us a little bit about the preeminent figures in Greek philosophy. We've talked about them a little bit, and the themes that they focused on.
Yeah, I mean, you have the famous triad of Socrates and his pupil Plato and his pupil Aristotle. And we've talked a little bit about them just in terms of their not liking democracy very much. Socrates and Plato, of course, are hard to distinguish from one another since, like Jesus, Socrates never wrote anything. So all we have is Plato's word for what he believed. They do seem to have a lot in common. Aristotle is rather different. Aristotle was much more commonsensical. Socrates and Plato really believed in abstract thought that really could be liberated from the minutiae of daily life. It was Plato who came up with the theory of forms, that there is such a thing as the ideal form of beauty, the ideal form of truth, and that these forms had a tremendous amount in common with one another. Aristotle thought that was the silliest thing he'd ever heard of. How could there be form, without matter? Plato and Socrates talked about how it was much better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice. And that going to your grave, Socrates said that all of life was a preparation for death, that going to your grave knowing that you had not done wrong was the most important thing. And Aristotle took a much more common sense view of the matter, and was different from Plato in many ways. You know, he liked concrete things. He liked animals. He was never happier than when he was studying animals. And he liked to watch the way things changed. Plato was not interested in anything concrete. He was very distressed by change. He did not like change. He wanted everything to be always abstract, always the same. Aristotle took a much more common sense view. He says, you know, how can you be, you know, a happy person if you have absolutely no money and you have no friends and you're ugly? And, you know, Plato and Socrates believed in, you know, an abstruse world in which, you know, you could be happy as long as you knew that you had done no wrong. So that even though they had a lot in common in terms of their dim view of democracy, the abstract level at which Plato and Socrates thought was not the way Aristotle thought at all. And Aristotle was interested in many more things than Plato. And he, you know, he believed in luck. I mean, when Socrates was about to be led off to execution, he had said to the jurors, remember, you know, if you voted for me, don't feel so bad that I'm going to die, because, you know, nothing could harm a good man, either in life or after death. And Aristotle's reaction was, come on, don't be ridiculous. Are you going to try to tell me that an ugly person who has no friends and no children, you know, could possibly be okay? You know, there's such a thing as lousy luck. I mean, Plato cherished the abstract. Aristotle delighted in the meticulous classification of species. He delighted in the concrete. Plato loved the general. Aristotle loved the specific. And then you get a completely different world when you get into Hellenistic philosophy, and you get into the Stoics and the Epicureans, who took very, very different views. They both believed in what they called ataraxia, untroubledness, that the goal of life was to be untroubled. They lived in a different world. Athens was under Macedonian domination. What Plato and Aristotle really wanted was for them and their pupils to have power in government. And the Stoics and the Epicureans took a different view. The Stoics liked to be involved in government. Certainly Roman Stoics were very involved in government. Stoicism was very popular in Rome. But Epicureans wanted to withdraw from that. Epicurus believed that they both believed that you had to shut out externals. But what Epicurus believed was that, you know, you found happiness by having a few friends and lying under a tree and sipping some cool water and not being too involved in what was going on around you. I've tried for years to sell the virtues of Epicureanism to my students, but it goes nowhere. I try to tell them Epicurus said that happiness was the absence of pain, and I try to tell them what it's like when you're driving. I live in New York City. When you're driving north on the West Side Highway and you're going 60 miles an hour, and the traffic going south is going about 2 miles an hour, and you feel wonderful. It's not that you're glad that they're suffering, but that it's a reminder, I'm going 60, I'm going to get there. And look at these poor schmucks in the other lane, and you think, you know, I'm glad I'm not them. Try to tell them what it's like when you're sure you left your wallet at the laundromat and you're going, oh my God, all my credit cards are in my, oh my God. And then you reach into the couch and there's your wallet. And isn't that the most wonderful pleasure? But I cannot sell, you know, 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds on the idea that pleasure is the absence of pain. They want something much more exciting for their lives. But both Epicureanism and Stoicism, and these are the self-help philosophies that you find today. There have been over 60 books published on Stoicism since the year 2000 in English alone. Stoicism is immensely popular, and in sort of strange ways. I mean, I talk a little bit in my book about the world known as the manosphere, which is a wacky bunch of misogynists online. It's sort of a loose collection of malcontents from all over the world who communicate mostly on the internet. They're men who are united by a conviction that the liberation of women has resulted in a degenerate society and that the world can only be salvaged if men cultivate a hyper masculinity that will restore traditional sex roles. And in countless websites, the movement appeals to Stoicism in proclaiming the superiority of men who operate on the basis of reason over women who are governed by emotion. One of the most remarkable books in the manosphere is a book called Bronze Age Mindset, the kind of mixture of impressive learning and misogynistic ravings, written by a fellow who's been since identified as a Romanian American, Costin Alamariu, whom I'm embarrassed to admit has a PhD from Yale, which is where my PhD is from. And he wrote that with the liberation of women in the 19th century, the West has given itself an infection that can be saved from complete collapse only if a few exceptional men dare to emulate the Greeks. He says that the Greek state was the product of free men accepting the rigors of trading together to preserve their freedom against racial subordinates at home. And he says these men would never have believed in anything as ridiculous as equality, which they would have seen as deferring to the opinions of, this is my favorite part, the opinions of slaves, aliens, and fat childless women. Okay. Then, the Spartans were very much admired by Hitler. And they've also afforded role models to American gun rights activists, a number of whom have appropriated Leonidas' response. It was said to Xerxes' request when Xerxes said to Leonidas at Thermopylae, hand over your weapons. Leonidas was said to have replied, Molon labe, come and take them. And when the Capitol in Washington was stormed on January 6, 2021, a lot of the rioters bore Molon labe insignia on their hats, while others wore reproductions of Greek helmets. And when Marjorie Taylor Greene refused to wear a mask during the COVID pandemic, she later turned up in Congress wearing a mask that said Molon labe, the motto of the gun rights lobby.
Yeah, you have a fascinating chapter at the end of your book where you discuss in great detail the ways in which ancient Greek culture is often abused by unscrupulous people. You also talk about the legacy of Stoicism in the modern world, and you reference cognitive behavioral therapy and the serenity prayer in that regard. Can you talk about that just a bit?
Yeah, I mean, Stoicism, as I've said, has been enormously popular in the 21st century. If you go to, well, people don't go to bookstores so much anymore. They go to Amazon. But if you were, hypothetically speaking, to go to a bookstore such as Barnes and Noble, you would see huge self-help sections, and an enormous amount of the self-help is Stoicism, and it undermined the so-called Serenity Prayer, composed by Reinhold Niebuhr and adopted in 1941 by Alcoholics Anonymous. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. It sounds so nice. I've been working on knowing the difference for as long as I can remember, and I still don't know the difference. But it sounds good, It sounds good. Why aren't I thinner? I mean, I don't know. But in 1955, the American psychologist Albert Ellis put forward his new treatment, rational emotive behavior therapy, citing the Stoics' contention that people are made unhappy not by external events, but by the views that they take of them. And he thanks Zeno in his preface. And if you think about it, a tremendous amount of basic psychotherapy involves reframing. A therapist will constantly say, let's reframe that. And that reframing is what Stoicism was really all about. I noticed just this week in the New York Post, the headline, Self-Made Billionaire Says Stoic Philosophy Key to Success. Apparently, Robert Rosencrantz, a self-made billionaire, has put forward in his book, The Stoic Capitalist, Advice for the Exceptionally Ambitious, the idea that the ancient wisdom from ancient philosophers like Epictetus and his Roman followers, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, has shaped his own success. He says, the whole book is about self-reliance, taking responsibility for your own life, and not worrying about things you can't change. So apparently Stoic philosophy can make you very rich. Stoicism is very much in today. I have a colleague at City College and the Graduate Center who writes many books on Stoicism and how it can help people. My son has a friend at the University of Texas Law School who is very interested in the ancient world and just wrote a wonderful book about Stoic philosophy. So it's everywhere.
Indeed, it is. Jennifer, as we wrap up today, I want to point out, as you do in your book, for all their virtues, ancient Greek culture is chock full of contradictions that are often overlooked by those of us who admire the Greeks so much. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The ancient Greeks were a fascinating people whom we tend to idealize today in ways that are not very helpful. I was having a disagreement with a friend just yesterday who was talking about how it would have been marvelous to live in Athens. And I said, well, depends whether you were enslaved or not, depends whether you were male or female. Depends how much time you had off to attend all the wonderful festivals and to admire the wonderful buildings. We certainly see in the Greeks very strong aesthetic values that we admire today and that we echo today. They also had no sense of universal human rights. They enslaved many people. As I mentioned earlier, there was no organized anti-slavery movement. The Athenians were brutally imperialist. We imagine today that the beautiful buildings on the Acropolis and throughout Greek islands and Asia Minor and Sicily and Italy, that these buildings were white, and they became really the poster buildings for white supremacy during the antebellum era in the South. Where you were really having these white collar mansions that advertised better living through slavery. And they were not, as we now know, white by any manner of means. They were very bright colors, a lot of yellows and reds and blues. And there's a marvelous exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum in New York recently of colorized Greek statuary, which gives us a sense of what it was like if you were in Greece in the Agora where people met to network. It was a very smelly place. There were animals who were defecating all over the place. There was blood from sacrifices. It was crowded. People were shouting. Refrigeration was not great. People got sick from food poisoning all the time. It was a very messy world, and let's not even mention the toilet situation. It was not the world that we imagine today of people just sitting around saying, "Isn't that a beautiful statue?" It might have been a beautiful statue, but it was certainly not a beautiful white statue, and most people didn't have time off from work to go to look at beautiful statues. So the Greeks had a tremendous civilization that was marred by tremendous blind spots.
My last comment, Jennifer, and question is that it's quite obvious your passion for the Greeks is palpable. You've dedicated your life to studying the ancients. Where does that passion come from?
Oh, that's a wonderful question to which I don't think I have the answer. I think it's fascinating how people wind up in careers. A friend of mine was telling me how he wound up in the branch of engineering that he did because of some issues with an elevator. And when I was 11 years old, my father was sent to work in Venezuela, and my mother and sister and I accompanied him, and I began studying Spanish. And when it came time to study a language in high school, I had really placed out of first year Spanish. So at my high school, we normally studied either Latin or ancient history. But because I placed out of first year Spanish, I studied both. Then after a couple of years of Latin, I'd had enough, but I was going to take Greek in college because I had a boyfriend who liked Greek. So I agreed to take Greek. And I was failing math. I had done in differential calculus in high school, so I thought, well, I'll do integral, but I wasn't doing too well. And then I wasn't doing too well with harmony because I played piano and I played cello, and I thought, I love music. I'm going to take harmony. But everybody else was way ahead of me, and I overheard a girl in the dining room one day sitting, oh, you'll never believe the stupid questions this girl asked in my harmony course. They were my questions. So I knew I had no future in integral calculus and no future in harmony. So I went to the dean. I said, what to do? She said, well, you're taking Greek and you had some Latin. So, Cicero's letters meets at the same time as that math class. I said, okay. The next thing I knew, I was a classics major. And the next thing I knew, I was going to graduate school. But, if my father had not been sent to Venezuela that summer, and if I'd been better at integral calculus, I might be a lawyer today. I don't know.
Jennifer Roberts is the author of the new book, Out of One Many, Ancient Greek Ways of Thought and Culture. Jennifer, thanks so much for doing this. This was so much fun. I appreciate your time.
And a great pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity.